working in a funeral home isn't for everyone. Many believe the worst part is seeing the bodies, but you get used to physical death very quickly. What you never get over is the silence. A silence so heavy that sometimes it feels like the walls have ears. My job is to prepare the viewing rooms, arrange the floral displays, adjust the lighting, and ensure everything is impeccable before the family arrives. It's a job that requires respect and a lot of silence. That night's body belonged to a man in his 70s, a local businessman who, according to the report, had died of a massive cardiac arrest while sleeping. It was around 2 a.m. and I was alone in room A. The dark wood casket was open, surrounded by wreaths of white flowers that gave off a sweet, piercing scent. I leaned in to adjust a ribbon on one of the side arrangements, right at the foot of the coffin. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioning. As I stretched the silk ribbon, I heard a dry sound, as if someone had scraped a fingernail against the silk lining inside the casket. I froze, hand still on the flower, thinking perhaps the wood was settling due to the temperature change. But then, the sound repeated, followed by a long, forced exhalation, as if someone were trying to catch their breath after a long time. I leaned in slightly, heart hammering against my ribs, thinking perhaps the body preparation process had trapped some air in the lungs. But just as my fingers touched the edge of the casket, a hoarse whisper, almost a pleur, rose from inside. "I'm not dead yet." The voice was so real and so close that I felt cold breath on my face. I recoiled instantly, knocking over a vase that shattered across the floor. I looked at the man's face. His eyes remained closed. His skin still had that grayish, lifeless tone of someone who has been in the morgue for hours. But his lips, I would swear they were slightly parted now, as if he had just spoken those words. I stood paralyzed, shards of the vase scattered at my feet. Logic told me it was impossible. The body had undergone basic embalming, and the coroner had signed the death certificate 12 hours ago. However, the whisper kept vibrating in my ears. With trembling hands, I pulled out my pocket flashlight and approached the edge of the casket again. I aimed the light directly at his face. No movement, no blinking. But as I lowered the beam toward his neck, I saw something that stopped my heart. A drop of cold sweat was sliding down his grayish skin. The dead don't sweat. Panic drove me to place 2 fingers on his carotid artery, desperately searching for a pulse that shouldn't exist. The skin was ice cold, like marble, but under the pressure of my fingers, I felt a minimal vibration, a rhythm so slow and weak, it felt like the echo of a distant heartbeat. "Sir," I whispered, my voice barely a thread in the vast room. At that moment, the man didn't open his eyes, but his right hand, resting on his chest, contracted slightly, closing into a weak fist. That's when I heard the second whisper, clearer this time, coming from between his motionless lips. "Help me. It burns." I ran out of the room toward the night director's office. I was frantic, screaming that the body in room A was alive. The director, a cold man used to the nerves of rookies, followed me back with a sigh of annoyance. When we entered, everything was calm. The body lay exactly as before, hands relaxed, skin dry. The director checked his pulse, checked his pupils, and looked at me with contempt. "It's gas, boy. The body releases trapped air. Get back to work." I forced myself to finish cleaning the broken glass, but I couldn't help glancing at the casket's reflection in the large window of the room. In the glass, the image was different. For a second, I saw the silhouette of the man sitting on the edge of the coffin, looking at me with an expression of absolute agony, while his hands desperately clawed at the air. When I turned my head to look at the real casket, he was still lying there, inert. I resigned that very dawn. Weeks later, I heard from a former co-worker that the family had requested an exhumation due to an inheritance issue. When they opened the casket at the cemetery, they found that the white silk lining had been shredded from the inside, and the man's fingertips were raw. The doctor said they were violent post-mortem spasms, but I know what I heard. That night, he wasn't asking to be saved from death, but to be saved from what came after. I work the night shift at a funeral home. It's an old building with high ceilings and hallways that always seem to be at a lower temperature than the rest of the city. My task is preventive maintenance and cleaning the common areas. At 3 a.m., the place is usually deserted unless there's a wake in progress, but that night the rooms were empty. I entered the main floor bathroom, a spacious place with white tiled walls and a massive mirror that runs across the wall above the sinks. I stepped up to wash my face. Exhaustion was starting to take its toll. I turned on the tap, felt the cold water on my hands, and as I looked up to see myself in the mirror, my heart stopped. Reflected behind me, right next to the entrance door I had closed myself, stood a man. He wore an impeccable dark suit and held a hat between his hands. His face was pale, almost the same color as the tiles, and he stared fixedly at me through the mirror with an expression of absolute serenity. Out of pure instinct, I spun my head around to see who it was. There was no one. The bathroom was completely empty. The door was still closed, and there was nowhere someone could hide in a fraction of a second. I sighed in relief, thinking the fluorescent lights and shadows had played a cruel trick on me. But when I looked back at the mirror, the man was still there. I froze, staring at my own reflection, and, just inches from my left shoulder, the figure of that stranger. He didn't move, he didn't blink. The most terrifying part was that, although my back was to the empty room, in the mirror, I could see the man slowly raising his hand and reaching toward my neck. I felt an intense cold on the nape of my neck, but when I looked back again, the air was still empty. Panic left me breathless. In the mirror, his hand was already brushing the back of my head, but my skin felt only a frigid void. I tried to move toward the exit, but my feet felt heavy, as if I were walking underwater. The most terrifying thing happened then. The man in the mirror wasn't just looking at me anymore. He started looking side to side, as if he was searching for something in my world, outside the glass. With superhuman effort, I managed to take a step toward the door. As I did, I saw in the reflection that the man moved too, but not to follow me. He leaned closer to the sink until his face occupied almost the entire mirror. His features were much sharper now. He had a small scar on his cheek, and his eyes were a blue so light they looked like glass. In the real world, I was alone in front of a cold porcelain sink, but in the mirror, he was invading my personal space. Suddenly, the man pressed both hands against the glass from the other side. I heard the real sound of the glass vibrating, a dry clack that echoed through the bathroom. His fingers left fog marks on the mirror, heat spots that began to appear before my eyes on a surface that should have been clean. Then he opened his mouth, and though no sound came out, the mirror began to crack exactly where his face was. I ran. I didn't look back until I crossed the funeral home door and reached the street under the streetlights. I didn't go back for my things. The next day I called to resign, and the owner, with an unnervingly calm voice, asked me to come by for my severance pay a week later, once the repairs were finished. When I returned, I avoided the bathroom, but as I passed the hallway, I saw the mirror had been replaced with a new one. The owner handed me my envelope and, before I left, asked if I remembered the man we prepared 2 weeks ago, a gentleman buried in his favorite suit and hat. He showed me the photo from the registry book. It was him. The same scar, the same glass eyes. What made me never look into a mirror in the dark again was what I saw as I was leaving. In the new bathroom mirror, just before the door closed, I saw my own reflection. My image in the glass didn't follow me. It had stayed standing at the sink, looking back with an expression of pure terror, while the hand of a man in a dark suit slowly appeared from the edge of the frame to cover its mouth. At San Judas funeral home, there is an unwritten rule. Everyone deserves a dignified farewell, even if they die alone. Last Wednesday, we received the body of a man who died in a public hospital. He had no documents, no phone, and no relatives to ask for him. The city paid for a basic service, and we assigned him to Room C, the smallest and most secluded in the building. At 10 p.m., the room was the definition of loneliness. The grey metal casket was closed in the center, surrounded by 4 electric candles that cast a sad, yellowish light. I was the only one in the building beside the guard at the main entrance. I passed by Room C on my way to the kitchen and stopped for a second. There wasn't a single flower, not a card, nothing but the hum of the light transformers. I sat at the reception to read a book. The silence was absolute. In this building, the wooden doors are heavy and creak when opened, and the marble hallways amplify every step. For 2 hours, I didn't hear a single noise. However, at midnight, I felt the temperature in the reception drop drastically, and a very strong scent of ancient incense began to filter through the vents. Puzzled, I got up to check the rooms. As I approached the hallway to Room C, I froze. The door, which I had left ajar myself, was now wide open. The room, which barely an hour ago was empty, was now crowded. There were at least 30 people, all dressed in rigorous mourning clothes, a black so deep it seemed to absorb the light. They were standing with their backs to the door, forming a perfect circle around the nameless man's casket. The most disturbing part wasn't their presence, but the fact that no one had passed the reception. No one had triggered the main door, and above all, not a single sigh could be heard. I stayed on the threshold, not daring to take a step inside. The group was so compact, you could barely see the casket. Everyone was motionless, heads slightly bowed. I gathered my courage and cleared my throat, trying to keep my voice from trembling. "Excuse me, we didn't register the entry of any group. Are you relatives of the deceased?" No one moved. No one turned their head. The silence was so thick I could hear the ticking of my own watch. I decided to walk toward the front to see their faces. But as I moved along the side of the room, I noticed something that made the hair on my arms stand up. Although the candlelights were intense, none of those people cast a shadow on the floor. They were like silhouettes cut out of the darkness. I reached the casket and looked at the nearest person, an elderly woman with a lace veil covering half her face. Her hands, clasped in front of her, were dry and yellowish like old paper. At that moment, all at once, they raised their heads and looked at me. There was no malice in their eyes, only an infinite sadness and a void that seemed bottomless. Then the woman in the veil spoke with a voice that sounded like the rustle of dry leaves. No one should cross alone. We are the ones who were never claimed. In a blink, the room lights flickered violently. It was only a second of darkness, but when the power stabilized, the room was completely empty. There was no trace of the 30 people, no smell of incense, no footprints on the waxed floor. However, on top of the grey metal casket, which before was bare, now lay a single ancient copper coin, worn by time. I ran to the security office to check the cameras. On the monitor, the footage of Room C showed something impossible. Throughout the night, the room appeared empty to the camera, but the floor weight detector indicated the room was supporting over 2 tons of extra load exactly at midnight. The next morning, when the municipal funeral service came to take the body for a pauper's burial, I handed them the coin. The driver, a man who had been in the trade for decades, looked at it with respect and placed it inside the deceased's pocket. "It's for the passage," he told me, without further explanation. Since that day, I understand that at San Judas's funeral home, there are never empty wakes. There are simply guests who only let themselves be seen when a dead man's loneliness is too heavy to bear. My work as a mortuary technician consists of restoring dignity to those who lost it upon dying. It's not art, it's technique, hydration, fixation, and cosmetics. That night, the atmosphere in the preparation room was particularly heavy due to the outdoor humidity. On the table I had a woman who had passed away after a long degenerative illness. Her face was sunken, and her features projected a suffering I had to erase before her family arrived at 8 a.m. I worked for 3 hours in absolute silence. I managed to relax the jaw, seal the lips with special adhesive, and apply a makeup base that returned a vital tone to her skin. She looked perfect, an expression of absolute peace, almost as if she were about to wake from a restful sleep. I felt satisfied. I cleaned my brushes, put the cosmetics back in the case, and walked to the sink at the end of the hall to disinfect my arms. While soaping up, I heard a dry sound coming from the preparation room. It was a metallic clack, like the gurney vibrating. I stayed still, hands full of foam. I thought maybe I hadn't braked the wheels properly. I went back, drying my hands with a disposable towel, but as I entered, I stopped in my tracks. The body hadn't moved, but the makeup I had worked so hard on was ruined. The upper lip, which I had sealed myself with surgical glue, had retracted upward, revealing the teeth in a tense, asymmetrical grimace. It wasn't a smile. It was a rictus of pure pain, as if, in the 5 minutes I was out, the body had reacted to an invisible stimulus. Most disturbing was that on the stainless steel table, right next to her right hand, there was a small trail of moisture, an erratic line that wasn't there before. I approached the table with my heart racing, trying to convince myself it was a common post-mortem reaction. Sometimes gases or tissue dehydration cause muscle spasms, but the adhesive I use is surgical grade. For the lips to separate that way, the internal muscle tension had to be violent. With trembling hands, I took an alcohol swab to clean the grimace and start over. That was when I noticed the moisture trail on the steel. It wasn't water. It was a mixture of condensation and embalming fluid that had leaked. The erratic line formed a single letter, an N, traced with minimal pressure, as if a finger had barely brushed the surface. I forced myself to ignore it. I took the instruments to massage the facial muscles and break the rigidity, but upon touching her cheek, I felt something that made me drop the forceps. The skin wasn't cold. Despite being in the cooling chamber for hours, The jaw area emitted a residual heat, almost imperceptible, as if a spark of energy was still burning under the tissue. At that moment, her eyelids, which I had fixed with eye caps, vibrated. It was a rapid movement, a nervous spasm that lasted barely a second, but it was enough for the eye makeup to crack. There were no screams or apparitions, only the sound of my own heavy breathing and the constant dripping of the sink at the end of the hall. I finished the job again, this time with double fixation, and stayed sitting in a corner of the room, watching the body until dawn. I didn't take my eyes off it for a second. The body didn't move again, but the expression of peace I achieved at the end felt fake, like a mask imposed on someone who was still fighting. At 8 a.m., the director arrived. I mentioned the spasms and the strange temperature. He just shrugged while reviewing the forensic report. She died of a nervous breakdown that led to a heart attack, he said without looking at me. Sometimes the brain sends residual signals hours after the heart stops. The body remembers the fear, that's all. I packed my things and left the funeral home. As I walked to my car, I looked at my fingertips. I could still feel that unnatural heat on my skin. I understood that my work isn't just aesthetic. Sometimes what we do at that table is forcibly close a door that the deceased doesn't want to close, forcing them to arrest their bodies out of pure terror, aren't ready for yet. Since then, I always ask to have a radio on with soft music while I work. It's not so I don't feel alone. It's so I don't have to hear the sound of skin stretching when a body tries, in silence, to express what it felt in its very last second of life. It's disturbing to think that the human body, even after drawing its last breath, can hold traces of memory, heat, or even will. Funeral homes are the final guardians of our physical secrets, and sometimes those secrets try to come to light before the burial. If you've ever felt an inexplicable cold draft, or thought you saw movement in a casket, maybe it wasn't just your imagination. Leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more night shift tales. And remember, respecting the dead is vital, especially when it feels like they are still listening to you.